everyone. Welcome to the talk about wild grazing on estates, building the road to bison. We are going to be sort of walking you through what Kent Wildlife Trust has been doing in terms of its grazing project over the last, well, we've been doing it for about 24 years now, but we're going to look at the last 5 years or so where we've really accelerated our use of grazing animals right the way across our estate. So as Katie said, my name's Alison. I am the estate area manager, but my second role is the livestock coordinator role. That means that I attempt to coordinate about 700 animals that Kent Wildlife Trust own. And we graze those over about 50 nature reserves over the course of the year in all different kinds of ways to benefit wildlife. So it's my job to try and get those 700 animals in the right place at the right time to be of greatest benefit for wildlife. So I'm going to talk about through some of the ways that we did this, some of the novel things we've tried, and then how that led towards the bison project. When we get to the bison part, I am going to hand you over to Don, who knows much more about it than I do. My job is all about the domesticated animals as opposed to the bison. So here we go. On your screen at the moment, there are a range of pictures of the animals that we currently own. Not all of them, some of them. And there are some captions that talk you through the kind of things that we've been doing with them. So most of the things on this slide are relatively what we would say are normal conservation grazing projects. So we're using cattle in grasslands to help us create species-rich grassland by taking off excessive grass growth and giving space for wildflowers to come through. We're using specific breeds that we know do very well with rough grazing, so like using our dexters, they're particularly good at managing bramble. And things like our hill and mountain breed sheep that are particularly good at getting rid of things like dogwood scrub invasion. And then also using things like our Exmoor ponies and our conic ponies mixed in with our livestock, because they have a completely different gut system. And so when you graze them mixed in together with cattle or sheep, you find that they help to keep the parasite burdens in their guts low. So if, as a worm that came out of a cow went into the grassland and a horse ate it, it would kill that worm and vice versa. So when you mix them in together, which is much more natural, that's what would happen in the wild. You get multiple species grazing, you get these benefits, like reducing worm burden for all of the animals that are grazing in the same area. They also have their own skills in really poor vegetation conditions as well. And then we've got things like using sheep to manage flood defences, to keep the grass knitted together, to maintain the grass embankments for flood defence. And we've even got things like our Sussex cattle, really calm, really chill, really laid back cows that are just perfect for using in really urban situations where we've got a lot of people. But all of these animals are doing a really basic conservation grazing job. They're removing certain types of vegetation to help others come to the fore, to support invertebrate populations, to support birds and small mammals and reptile populations. So this is all very much sort of basic conservation grazing. With conservation grazing, traditional conservation grazing, you have a target that you're aiming for, so that you know your nature reserve is particularly good for something. And what you want to do is get the site as close to that, usually to that structure as possible. So for chalk grassland, for instance, the standard would be 2 to 5 centimetres by the end of February, which gives enough open ground for the rare plants, orchid species, the tiny, tiny little invertebrates to use the site in the way that we would want them to. So for many of our SSIs, our SACs, those are really important wildlife rich sites. We have very specific targets which we aim to get to using animals. So for conservation grazing, you're normally aiming for a target. Using a wilder grazing approach. So on those sites where there isn't such a definitive target that we need to reach for a specific key rare species, we're looking for a mixture of structure. And that's where these animals really come into their own with wilder grazing. This is where we don't have a target. We have the ability to allow the animals to make their natural decisions in how they manage the habitat, which bring biodiversity benefits. So I'll show you some examples. So on the left of your screen, you will see odd goat faces poking out there here and there. So this, it's a nature reserve, very, very ancient, used to be heathland with some remnant bits of woodland, but has a lot of historic sort of Roman and pre-Roman structure in it as well, that's being slowly but surely swamped by vegetation. So we've put a herd of goats on here, and they are slowly but surely clearing the chestnut coppice that was planted over the old Roman remains. And they are naturally reducing the amount of woodland cover and opening up the heath and the mixed vegetation. So the picture in the bottom left corner shows it after a couple of years. Much more mixed structure, much more sunshine, much more edge habitat, much better for things like reptiles and invertebrate populations than the very monoculture chestnut stand. So rather than us coming in and taking out the chestnut or using volunteers to cut back chestnut regrowth year after year, the goats do it for us, and they choose where to do it, and we monitor them to make sure they're not clearing too much. On the right hand side, you will see what at first glance looks like a standard white sheep. It is actually a very, very rare white-faced woodlands, which are a Cheviot cross sheep. On the right at the top of the Rare Breed Survival Trust endangered breeds list, very, very few of them in the country, but they are fantastic at managing woodland habitat because that is where that they were bred to be. The original stories say that the Romans bred them to go with them on marches, through long distance marches across the country as they were moving from camp to camp. So they had fresh milk and even meat, but at the time the milk was the more valuable. So they needed a strong, sure-footed, agile sheep that could live on browse and woody vegetation, whatever they happened to be near when they camped. And this animal has changed very little since that time. And when we use it in our woodlands, we can see instantly that it's targeting woody species. So it's targeting chestnut, bramble, bracken, opening up glades within woodland and reducing the scrub cover and creating glades, which are benefiting the wildflowers. We've also used them at Hunstead, where there's been bog creation work, and they're keeping the bog habitats open as well by grazing across a wide mix of landscapes, rather than focusing on grass the way that some normal sheep might be thought to do. They're very, very different in their behaviour. On the right hand side, you'll see a picture of our fantastic Sussex cattle managing South Blean Woods. So these are an unusual place to put cattle. Don't normally think about them being in woods, but the Sussex cattle are a local breed. They are the ones that were bred and evolved to live in the woodlands in the Weald of Kent, and also in some little grass pastures, but very much kind of scrubby edges of habitat, and also very wet habitats. So they're very, very good in wet and woodland habitats, and they thrive on leafy and woody vegetation, creating fantastic ride edges and reducing the scrub vigor, opening up sort of heathy bits and glades again within woodland. So I think there's a little video, hopefully it'll play for you. It's a bit blocky, I know, on Zoom, but just see how much they're really looking at taking out the leaf canopy where they can. On the left-hand side is one of our fabulous longhorn cattle, an incredibly docile breed. They can look fearsome with their long horns. They're a really laid-back animal. They were often a draft animal, the same as the Sussex. So they were often trained to a harness to pull carts and ploughs in terrain where horses couldn't manage the deep or wet ground. So they have a really laid back attitude to life, which is fantastic when you're grazing in urban spaces. So our longhorns go onto quite a lot of our busy urban sites because they're such good temperaments to deal with everything they might come across. And this one is in fact taken on a site in Gillingham, right in the heart of the Medway towns. There's another great picture here on the left hand side. This is where our Sussex are coming into their own again. You can see in the top left again the cattle disappearing into the reed bed there at all marshes. Very overgrown, very difficult for the wetland birds to use that habitat because there was no open standing water. And although it's difficult to believe, the pictures just to the right of it are of the same location about 4 to 5 months afterwards. So the cattle really targeting the reeds, and you can see one of their calves, so that's a Sussex Cross Angus, really happy splodging about in the water right up to his belly, reaching in, grabbing the reeds, and actually creating these fantastic wetland habitats. Something that you wouldn't normally think about would be putting cattle out onto a really wet habitat like this. They've done a really, really fantastic job at all marshes for us. And on the right hand side, you've got a picture of Brenchley Woods. So for many years, we tried to manage it with sheep, but for various reasons, it just didn't work. So we decided to have a conversation with the local horse riders that have a permissive bridleway through the site, and they agreed to close the bridleway for 6 weeks of the year while we put our own ponies on. And they've been much better, as you can see in the second photograph, trampling back all the bracken, opening up all that bare ground. This was a really sort of damaged bit of heathland with lots of bracken killing off the heather, and the sheep just weren't big enough to knock back the bracken and allow the heather to come through. All this bare ground was fantastic. Then the following spring, it all started coming up with new plant species, new heather seedlings, all of starting to break through on that surface now that the ponies have cleared. So it was a bit of a challenge to have those conversations and to make those changes to the sites from the traditional management and do something a little bit different. But they've been really, really positive for wildlife. Some of the other sort of strange things that we're doing at first glance is we've taken on a golf course, an old abandoned golf course. We're looking at how we can build nature and biodiversity back into some really highly managed systems. So this is now what you would call Heather Corey Vale, which is a beautiful big kind of 50 hectares of grass, scrub edge, bramble, and the sand bunkers, which are fantastic for mining bees. And this site is just being slowly allowed to rewild itself, with hopefully by the end of this winter a small herd of longhorn cattle grazing it just to keep the structure of the vegetation mixed. And something else that we've done, which not many other people are looking at the moment, pigs are used quite commonly in woodlands these days for conservation management. Their ground disturbance helps to bring new seeds to the surface, helps to create small wet areas that are fantastic for invertebrates. There's a real good symbiotic relationship between pigs and invertebrates, and then bird species that follow them. But they're not very often used in grassland. So it was quite an unusual thing again. Something a little bit different that we were doing is looking at how we could use pigs to replace tractors within a nature reserve. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Having looked at some of the ways in which we use some of our different breeds and species of animals, we're just going to walk you through one example. So one nature reserve that's run through the whole gambit from conservation grazing through to a wilder grazing approach, and some of the lessons we learned from that and how we then moved on to the next stage of looking at bigger and even more interesting mega herbivores. So Nashon and Down we bought about 12 years ago. It's 127 acres of mud. So this is literally what we bought, was a large arable field. Nothing else in there because it had been heavily fertilized, herbicided and pesticided to create a wheat, rape and barley rotation crop. So there was literally no wildlife left on this site. So you see it in this picture looking over the M2 here, this vast expanse of green that was all wheat. So no diversity at all and very, very little wildlife in that site. So we did the normal conservation thing, although we were starting from a very unusual standpoint. People did think we were a little bit odd for buying 130 acres of mud. But we put a fence up. You see the fence going in all the way around it, but we fenced out. See, we were conservation grazing at the time, so we were going to target our conservation grazing at the grassland. So bear in mind, this is 12 years ago, and we hadn't really thought about the impact of grazing within the scrub mosaic. So we'd fenced that out. And then we also put up a dividing fence so that we could rotationally graze. We would graze 1/3 of the site at a time. We put on a water supply, so they all had access to water, and then we seeded it. About half of it was seeded with a wildflower and grass mix, and half of it was left to restore naturally. And then we borrowed the neighbours' commercial sheep to graze the grassland. And you can see this is after a couple of years, the grassland's starting to come through and the neighbours' sheep are on the site. So far, so good. So we've turned an arable field into kind of a grassy pasture. Not brilliant for wildlife yet, but better. But then we had lots of problems. We followed the conservation grazing pattern and we did everything we were supposed to, but we had way too much grass in some areas, which led to these really dense, thick tussocks of grass that then died, fell over, matted everything up, and then nothing could grow through them. We had the wrong sort of grass. We had lots and lots of barren brome grass. So lots of one type of grass that's particularly difficult for the animals to eat can get quite invasive. And because the animals weren't eating it, nothing else was able to grow through it. And then in some places, ironically, we didn't have any grass at all for some reason or other. The site just decided that really didn't want to be grass and had lots of different theories on that, whether or not it was wireworm in the soil or leftover contamination of a herbicide, or a difference in aspect or soil. We never really got to the bottom of that. But across the site, we had all of these very odd problems in terms of having too much grass, wrong kind of grass, too much of the same kind of grass, or no grass at all. And then if we weren't worrying about the grass, we had way too many thistles. So we don't mind creeping thistle, up to sort of 15, 20% even. It's a fantastic nectar source. It's a great seed source for finches. Things like goldfinches love creeping thistle seed. But when you've got 50 to 60 to 70 to 80% of your site is covered in one type of plant, you know there's a little bit of an imbalance going on there. So we had way too many creeping thistles in the grassland. Some areas were almost 100% creeping thistle, and they were shading out and killing off every other type of plant that we wanted to be there. We had way too many thistles in the arable. So I must admit, I've forgotten to mention that. Nashenden was fairly unique in the sense that 1/3 of the site was put aside for arable. So we ploughed it every year and put a barley crop in, only at 50% the normal stocking rate, which meant there was space for arable wildflowers to grow in between. So arable wildflowers aren't really arable wildflowers. They're wildflowers that need disturbed ground as part of their life cycle. They literally cannot germinate unless the ground is turned over and disturbed in some way. They need that dormancy and then they need that sunlight and air. So we wanted to make the right habitat for these disturbed ground plants. So we put some of our nature reserve into arable production, which again was fairly unique for sort of 15 years ago. And it had worked, but every time we ploughed the ground to put the new crop in, we got more thistle because we broke up all the thistle root and it spread it, and then more thistle grew. So by the end of the 10-year project, something like 90% of our arable field was creeping thistle, and we didn't have any of the arable wildflowers left, any of the disturbed ground wildflowers that we wanted to see. So we had a real problem with thistle in the arable section. It meant it wasn't doing what we needed it to do for wildlife anymore. And we also had so many creeping thistles that they actually broke through and broke down the liner for the ponds that we put in. and drained all the ponds as well. So we got to the point where the creeping thistle was that invasive that it actually broke apart the pond liner. So we definitely had a problem with creeping thistle. Some of the other things that we had were problems that we had because we had a conservation head on. We had arable wildflowers, but in the wrong place. They decided to grow in an area that we, in our minds, had put aside for chalk downland. And we decided that that was going to be a chalk downland area. And then Mother Nature decided it was actually going to be arable wildflowers, which was fantastic, but not what we were expecting. Or in some cases where we tried to start our woodland, we tried to replace 3 acres of woodland that had been destroyed in the 1970s. So we replanted the woodland area, but all we got was vast amounts of clematis that were strangling and killing all of the plants that we were putting in. And so we couldn't get our woodland going. We don't mind a bit of clematis, and it's great for things to hide in and to nest in, but we couldn't have it at the time because it was killing off all of our trees. So our conservation approach wasn't necessarily working. So we were thinking, with all of our combined knowledge now, in the estates team, between us, we have something like 150 years worth of conservation grazing knowledge between us all. We must know how to do this better. So we started to look for our inspiration from our animals. This is where the wilder approach came in. So one of the first things we did is we changed the commercial sheep that were grazing the site and that were very much focused on eating grass and grass only, and only the right kinds of grass, into our mountain and upland sheep. Specifically, we really went for our Herdwicks here, and they've been brilliant. Herdwicks, Hebrideans, Manx, and our white-faced woodlands are the core of our sheep breeds, and they're all upland or mountain breeds of sheep. This means they are kind of genetically pre-programmed to target rough vegetation. So the things that they've been eating, you can see in the pictures on the right-hand side, all of the arable weeds that we were getting, the really strong, vigorous plants that were out shading our arable plants, our rarer arable plants, have all been eaten off and chewed up. But the grass, and you see there's plenty of grass still, but they've really targeted those weed species we didn't want. And in the bottom right-hand picture, it might not be very clear on your screens, but you see the arrows are pointing to the creeping thistle. Remember that creeping thistle we were having so much trouble with? Now, all of that creeping thistles had all of the flowers taken off of it. Herdwick sheep, it turns out, love creeping thistle flowers. They've reduced our creeping thistle in our grassland areas by something like down to less than 10% of the site now has got creeping thistle on it, in large part due to the actions of the Herdwick sheep. But you can see there's still, the wildflowers are still there. So birdsfoot trefoil, the bottom left of that photo, and marjoram there. So both great nectar sources, they've been left untouched, but the creeping thistle has been well chewed in a very dense grassy sward as well. So they're moving through the grass and targeting exactly the plants that we want them to eat, because we're using a wilder, more old-fashioned breed of animal. We've also taken the fences away. Now it was quite a big step from a conservation grazing person who wants to have control over everything, to give the animals control over where they go and what they choose to eat, and trusting that they're going to eat the right thing at the right time if we've got the breeds right. But this has been brilliant. The sheep pretty much, I thought they were going to go for the downland flowers, but they haven't. They've gone straight for the arable weeds and the creeping thistle, still leaving much of the wildflowers to do their thing, which has just been great. We've also built loads more ponds, but we used a very different liner so that hopefully the creeping thistle can't break through it. But now the sheep are controlling it, we have less worries about creeping thistle, but it does change the behavior of the animals. So our Hebridean sheep, for instance, once they got a pond towards the top of the nature reserve, they never came off the top of the nature reserve. Our mountain sheep love to have a view. So they sit right on the top of the reserve and graze all along the hedgerow edges and the scrubby edges, go down to the pond and then back up to sit on their high point. They never come down to the bottom half of the reserve anymore because they don't have to. It's completely changed the way that they use the reserve. But our biggest probable, not risk, but our biggest unusual thing we did is we decided to try and replace a tractor with pigs. So we let the pigs have free roam as well. We thought they'd probably work in the arable area, the area that we decided was going to be arable, because it was on the lower slopes and the deeper soils. But interestingly, they didn't choose to go to the arable area at all. They went to one of the areas we'd made to be grassland, which, you know, will give you a bit of a heart flutter when you're a nice bit of grass and suddenly starts getting rooted up. You can see when they're hard at work last autumn, how much they were digging up. They did about 4 or 5 acres between the 2 pigs over the course of the winter. But bear in mind, we used to use a tractor to do almost 30 acres. So in fact, the pigs only did 1/6 of what we used to do with a machine. So they're actually doing a lot less ground disturbance. But the interesting thing is they're doing it in different places. They are doing it in deeper soils, but they're doing it close to woodlands and close to scrub edges rather than out in the open. And the picture in the bottom with all the flowers in it is some of the flowers that are in those disturbed ground areas. And interestingly, and one of our key things from this change has been that these pictures were all taken end of October last year. So normally in a chalk grassland, you would expect all the flowers to be in flower in kind of June and July to have a big summer show of wildflowers. But we wouldn't normally expect to still see things in flower as late as the end of October. But what we're finding is with the grazing and the rootling, where plants are getting nibbled off, they're coming back and flowering later on. So where we've got really low stocking densities and the animals are moving around in very low numbers across the site, nibbling a bit here, nibbling a bit there, those plants then flower later. It extends the flowering season massively. So we've now got food source for those nectar drinking insects right the way through the season, rather than them suddenly only having food for 2 months of the year. So this is going to be great for our invertebrate populations. Some of what Nashenden now looks like, if you go there at the right time and on the right day, fantastic areas of wildflowers. This has all happened in the last few years since we changed to using our Hebrideans and our Herdwick sheep up here. Getting orchids popping up, we're getting wildflowers coming through, we're getting much better management of the grassland, getting a lot more things like dragonflies. But what I think was even more exciting is what's happened in the pig areas. The pigs have now been on for about a year, just over. You can see these are some of the rootal areas. You can see things like cudweed in your bottom left-hand corner. So that's a lovely arable weed popped up in the middle of the grassland. We've not seen that since we put the grass down 15 years ago. The ones in so along the top, you've got corn cockle, which is coming through a seed mix. But the next one along is horseshoe vetch, incredibly rare plant, likes a bit of open disturbed ground, absolutely essential for Adonis blue butterfly. So horseshoe vetch is really enjoying the edges of the pig rootals. The next one along the top, so third from the left along the top, that's a pig rootal that's completely grown over this spring, completely recolonized with vegetation, mostly arable weeds. There's a close-up shot on that top right-hand corner. The main 2 flowers you can see are fluellen and black knotweed, both of which are excellent seed sources for things like turtle dove. So really, really nice to see these arable wildflowers starting to come back in these areas where the pigs have been turning over the ground. And bearing in mind, this area they've been turning over hasn't been arable for like 10 or 15 years. What they are managing to do is root around small areas of scrub that we've got growing up. So bottom left one along, you can see a little bit of hawthorn starting to grow away there, and it's starting to get away. We're getting scrub and bramble coming up into the field now, getting a mixture of structure. Our arable area is now much, much better. The creeping thistle's virtually gone. We've got lots of arable wildflowers starting to have space to come through. And in some areas, the pigs where they've rooted that bit deeper, we've still got about an acre or so that's quite open. And you might look at that and think, wow, that looks awful. But it's fantastic skylark hunting plots. You think about the way that the farmers do a skylark plot where they turn off the drill for 10 meters or so and get a 10-meter bare patch in the middle of their field. This is exactly what they've got here. Bare ground that the skylarks need to hunt in. But it's also got lots of nooks, crannies and crevices, which encourages more spiders and insects to use them. But also, if you can just about see that big block of yellow at the top there, that's ladies' bed straw. So that's a really unusual chalk down and plant that seems to be doing really, really well in the pig rooters. So it can look quite dramatic, but it's really interesting to see how putting something like that back into a habitat has created a massive change in the biodiversity and the species diversity of what was an okay bit of grassland. It really seems to have really pushed on the grassland in terms of its diversity. But with that comes other things that we need to think about. So when you're putting animals in huge open spaces and giving them lots of different structure and habitats to play in and hide in, you do need to be able to find them back to do their welfare checks. So the picture on the left is just an example of one of our Sussex cows in that South Blean Woods complex wearing a GPS tracker. Basically sends a signal to an app that allows us to locate the animals, sends a signal every half an hour. So in fairness, if they're walking quite quickly, it can be a little bit out of date, but it really helps to narrow down the search area when the cattle are roaming in something like 200 hectares of woodland. So it allows our livestock checkers to find them a little bit more easily. And we're rolling this out to more and more of our animals as more of them are being given more space. On the right hand side is a picture of our livestock manager, Mike, and the longhorn bull, Lance. He's going to be one of the animals that go to the Blean. So he was bought as a mature bull from a cull market. So he was actually due to be culled because he'd got full grown and he was considered to be not any good for commercial use anymore. But he's got a fantastic temperament. He's really, really good guy. So, but because he'd been in a commercial system, he had really, really poor feet. So you can see we needed to use some quite clever system to get sort of a ton and a bit of bull raised up and held tightly enough that you can give himself a little pedicure to help sort his feet out. And now he's been running out on a chalk downland site, so he's lost a bit of his excess weight. His feet have really come good, and he's still got that fantastic temperament that we want for an animal that's in a public space. But we do need to have that kind of kit behind us to be looking after animals as well. And not only do we need the kit, but we need the volunteers as well. So in the middle picture, it shows me doing a livestock checker training course where we're training volunteers to do daily welfare checks for our animals. They're out on something like 40 sites. There's no way members of staff could get around all 40 sites every day. So we rely on having a network of livestock checkers. We've currently got almost 200 active trained volunteers that go out every day looking and monitoring our animals, making sure they're healthy, happy and safe. So some of that includes things like using online resources. So we've been creating things like ID guides for issues that people might come across, gathering up pictures from over the years of different things. So this is part of our signs and symptoms guide that all of our livestock checkers get now, which helps them to see what they're spotting on the site. So the cattle noses is quite a good one, you know, being able to tell the difference between the one on the left that has an infection and needs antibiotics to the one on the right that's actually just dealing with a little bit of heat stress. So really, really useful for the guys to get that sort of information so they can help them to understand what they're seeing on the site and give us better reports and better quality checks so that we can maintain really, really high welfare standards, even when the animals have a lot of choice in how and where they live and move and sleep and eat and all those other things. So just because they're extensive and just because they're free ranging doesn't mean to say that they can't be high welfare. And we've also started doing things like trying to get our knowledge about all the different types of grazing that we've done over the years and all the different types of habitats with all the different types of animals. We've got a huge amount of knowledge about how we can manage different sites. We're trying to put all of that together in a way that can support other people. But it also means that we can start to look at how we do new sites and how we gauge what kind of levels of grazing will match natural levels of grazing. So that's kind of this is one element of that, is how do we decide how many animals are the right animals for a site? once the animals are on, we can see, because we can see if the wildlife is responding positively to the animals that are on site. But we want to try and get it right from the get-go. So having this kind of information that allows us to put together roughly the right mixes of animals onto a site to boost the biodiversity is really, really useful. So hopefully this kind of first introduction to sort of how Kent Wildlife Trust has been using lots of different animals in lots of different ways and in some slightly unusual, surprising ways. And having that knowledge base and having those welfare systems and the technology behind us has allowed us to kind of build the kind of professional knowledge and capacity that's taken us on to the next step, which is the Bison project. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Don, who's then going to sort of talk you through how the bison are developing nature reserves in a different way compared to all the domestic animals that we've seen below, how they're taking it to the next step and how this is the next level of the project. So over to you, Don.
Thank you so much, Alison. Wow, that's so interesting. Thank you. You can go with the first things. Hi, folks. Last month was a landmark moment for conservation here in Kent and in the UK when European bison were released into the Bloomwoods. The matriarch led the herd with two young females. The matriarch is 14 years old and the two youngsters are 4 years old each. We're eagerly awaiting the arrival of the male. And the question is, why European bison? Why did we choose European bison? And the answer is that they've got an amazing superpower. They have the ability to create a rich mosaic of habitats in which other species are able to not only survive, but thrive. They are experts at restoring natural processes, creating these little micro habitats and increasing the variety and abundance of species within the woods. In so doing, they build resilience within the ecosystem, and they're helping us fight the current climate and biodiversity crisis that we're facing. How do the European bison do this? And the secret is to let nature take control. Just step back and give nature the space to heal and allow the bison to get along with bison business. It's that simple. Thanks, Alison. Thanks. From the first day that we released the bison into the woods, the impact was astounding and much quicker than we thought. And one of the first things that we noticed were these incredible trails that they were creating in the dense silver birch thickets. Wow, before the bison were released, I tried to walk through these thickets just to see, what was inside there. And when I got out the other side, it looked like I'd crawled through razor wire. And today, these trails are about 1 meter wide, and wow, it's absolutely incredible. I guess that's one of the benefits of being the largest land mammal in the UK is you don't have to walk around much; you just walk straight through. And it's, we're not the only ones that are loving these trails. We've also seen foxes using them. We've seen rabbits using them, and a slow worm sunbathing on one, which was lovely to see. As Alison was saying, every year we have teams of dedicated and passionate volunteers that work in the Bleen, and one of the things they do is they cut back the bramble, the bracken, and wow, the bison are just apart from feeding off the bracken, which has been quite surprising, is that they trample it into the ground. And so they are doing a fantastic job of managing the bramble. And yeah, it's just creating these natural rides and glades. When you look at an aerial photograph of Blean at the moment, there's a lot of straight lines, and it's from the old forestry days. And slowly but surely, those straight lines are going to start blurring. Nature is wonderfully messy. Thanks, Alison. Thanks a lot. Something else we're noticing is the debarking. Wow, the bison definitely have favorites. One of their favorites is silver birch, and another is willow. And yeah, they've got this incredible ability to walk into the silver birch thickets, and they'll spot a willow 20, 30 meters in, and they'll head straight to it and debark it. And they've figured out that if they, when they're debarking the willow, if they pull the strips up, it'll run much higher than they can reach. So they shred it almost like these little hair strips that are hanging off, and then they pluck them off. So they're really making the most of it. And this is the debarking and these trails are, it's just, the debarking is a fantastic for the ecosystem, because it's eventually we're going to have all this standing deadwood that's going to be home to woodpeckers and bats and fungi and invertebrates, and we're going to have yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And they're also opening up the canopy, allowing light to penetrate through to the woodland floor. So we can't wait to see which flowering plants, all these seeds that have been lying dormant in the ground for what's going to come through. Thanks, Alison. Thank you. Something else we're noticing is rubbing, and fantastic. The bison are picking some very large conifer trees, and they're using them repeatedly, rubbing up against them, which is great. So they're stripping the bark off these trees, which will also eventually become standing deadwood. And in the photographs, you can see the bison fur that's stuck to the bark, and eventually the birds will be collecting this fur and using it during a nesting season to line their nests and increasing the hatchability rate, which is which we can't wait to see. Thanks, Alison. Thank you. Something else that we're noticing is dust bathing. Bison love dust bathing, and they use these sites repeatedly. And they grow in size over time, and they're linked by all these trails. And this is, again, a fantastic area for your pioneering plants and for your sand lizards. Actually, I've spotted one today, which, wow, I was quite amazed at the size of it. And so, yeah, we definitely be monitoring those, but another tremendous impact in the woods. Thanks, Alison. Thanks a lot. One of the amazing things is that the bison are surprising us already. I mean, they've been there for a month, and on the first day, you can see this photograph on the left-hand side as a picture of a rhododendron thicket, and that thicket was about head height, and at the moment it's about knee height, even lower than knee height. And on the first day, the matriarch spotted that thicket. She went in there and she slashed her horns through it in like a figure-of-8 motion and just shredded it and walked out with this huge rhododendron wig. And we were both, everybody was like, wow, did not expect that. And yeah, perhaps there's some sort of insect repellent in there that she's after. I'm not too sure. So, but we're very, very grateful that they are taking care of the rhododendron for us. So that's really, that was quite a surprise. And the second photograph from the left is a ewe. Wow, I can't tell you how many times I've learned not to put nature in a box. And before the bison arrived, if you had said to me that the bison would be debarking ewe, I probably would have said, well, it's unlikely. And there is proof. They are debarking you, which is very, very surprising. And something interesting about this is that we're taking fecal samples at the moment for 2 different groups, and I was chatting to one of the teams the other day, and the gentleman was saying that they've noticed a decrease in the parasitic loads. So maybe these bison know something that we don't, and they're self-medicating. Possible. But yeah, very, very, very surprising. The third photograph on the right is also wonderful to see. The birds have very, very quickly realized that when you get a fresh bison pile of dung on the floor, this attracts invertebrates. And you can see clearly the peck marks in the dung, how they've been pecking away at all the invertebrates, taking advantage, which is fantastic to see. And we've started to see dung beetles, which is, again, really, really fantastic. And also fungus, different types of fungi growing from the dung. So yeah, lots of fertilizing happening, seed dispersal, which is brilliant. But bottom left, yeah, this was quite a surprise, a very obvious one, but just something that I didn't expect. We're seeing a lot of old deadwood lying on the floor, and as the bison are walking through the woods, they step on it and they smash it up. So, which is another great impact that the bison are having. And then you can see the bison there, one of the young females standing in the middle of the heath and the heather, and she's feeding off it, which is also very, very surprising. And they love it. They seek out these patches and they rest in it during the day, and they use it as almost like a comb, a brush, to keep the parasites, the flies, away from their face. So they swish their heads through it, which is amazing to see. And another surprise on the bottom right there is you can see how they've trampled the bracken flat, and they've been feeding off the bramble. Interestingly, the matriarch doesn't feed off bramble, but the 2 young females love it, especially the fresh green growth. But if you look closely, you'll see a sweet chestnut, and we thought that they are going to love the sweet chestnut. And so far, they've been debarking them, but they haven't been eating the leaves. So we can't wait to see what's going to happen when they're released from the soft release area out into the wider area, because there's all this fresh green growth in the copper sweet chestnut, and it'll be interesting to see if they feed off that. I'm sure they will. But yeah, another surprise. So you can. The best part of this is that this is just the beginning. The bison have been there a month, and we're already learning a tremendous amount. And it's an amazing opportunity to learn and to appreciate the wonders of nature for years to come. So thank you for your time. Thanks, Alison. Thank you.